Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of April of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. During the previous 24-36 hours, the Russians conducted another massive missile and not missile but probably drone strikes all over the entire territory of Ukraine. And the most important that if you take a look at the map, you're going to see that the most of the explosions and most of the strikes are from the Russian Armed Forces of Russian Federation were conducted along the railways. So you can see first strike, the second area fire anomaly, the third strike, and the final strike, destination Kharkiv. Let's go from the first point and let's discuss those attacks. On this, for example, let's say area, we can see the energy facilities that the Ukrainians were using to support the railways, the electricity trains, electric trains, and the railways. So very likely the Russians were attacking these energy facilities construction just to slow down the Ukrainian trains and to slow down the redeployment of Western supply support, maybe forces from one part of Ukraine to another. Then when we're moving to Dnipro, we have a very big fire anomaly in the vicinity of the town by the name of Kamyanska. Very big fire anomaly, as you can see. And if we zoom in at the, let's say, the map, we're going to see there is a very big storage, very big fuel depot, and very big industrial area with significant number of railways. Very likely the Ukrainians are using this part of Ukraine, this part of the industrial zone as the warehouses, as the storage for weapon, for missiles, for tanks, for fuel as well, for some parts, and many other military things. So as you can see, this explosion took place right exactly along the railways. Let's say the next point from the previous strike in the vicinity of the town by the name of Молодежная. If we move further to the east, we're going to see another strikes that took place in the area by the name of Lazova. Another warehouse, another industrial zone was under very heavy fire with Russian drones. Also very likely, and according to information we have, the explosions took place in industrial zone and we have a lot of secondary detonations. Probably the Russians destroyed another very big ammo depot. And the final strike took place a little bit further to the north from Lazova in the area of the village by the name of, or town by the name of Merefa. Few more explosions, and currently we have, let's say, the photos of the results of Russian strikes. More, let's say, some warehouses, ammo depots were destroyed. And we have lots of explosions inside of Kharkiv. And as you can see, Kharkiv is completely, let's say, without any protection from the Ukrainian side. The sources are saying, the local sources, the local Minister of Energy stated that there are around 350,000 consumers remain without electricity. We see that there are no, let's say, air defense in the town. We can see lots of, let's say, drone strikes, also ground strikes that took place during the previous night. A lot of explosions. Later in the morning, we got some videos and photos confirming the results of the strikes. For example, on this video, we can see the results of Russian attack. The buildings were damaged heavily, some parts of the buildings were completely reduced to ruins, and these are the consequences of ground drone strikes. Furthermore, we have few more explosions in this part of Kharkiv, and on this video, for example, we can see also more consequences of Russian attack. So, and everything was destroyed along the railways from Kharkiv to the western part of Ukraine. So very likely during the previous night, the Ukrainians were trying to redeploy some additional forces on this direction, but those forces got under Russian fire and were completely destroyed. Now we are moving to the line of combat contact, and first let's talk about the southern Kupiansk direction, because we don't have anything from the northern Kupiansk. On the southern Kupiansk direction, today some Russian sources reported about Russian offensive operations towards Terny, but as I understand, those were just speculations and nothing more. We have a few more videos from the Ukrainian side of FPV drone strikes. As we discussed in the previous videos, the Ukrainians established complete FPV drone control over the territory. We see certain Russian problems in air defense and electronic warfare equipment. On this video, for example, we can see the valuable and very important type of weapon, flamethrower system, was basically discovered by the Ukrainians and without any resistance was destroyed as a result of FPV drone strike. There was a very heavy explosion. We see that the Russians stopped on this direction. During the previous months, they managed to advance towards Terny, but now we see completely absence of any movements from the Russian side further to the west. Now we are moving to Siversk direction, where we had a lot of very interesting details and updates. And first, let's talk about the southern direction, the Russian attacks towards Vyimka and the railway station Vyimka. So in the previous update, we have already discussed the Russian assault operation among the fields. On this video, for example, we can see at the beginning the Ukrainian 10 soldiers decided to fall back from the area without any resistance, without any clashes with the Russians. They start just running away from the trenches to the north towards the more reliable positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. On the second part of the video, we can see the Russian stormtroopers, probably 5 or 6 stormtroopers, were finishing the clearing of trenches. So I have a lot of questions why the 10 Ukrainian soldiers decided to fall back and to step back and not to fight with 5 or 6 Russian soldiers. I don't have any explanation about this. Maybe these trenches were located in the gray zone, but basically the Russians just maintained the area and forced the Ukrainians to fall back, and the Ukrainians returned back to the north towards more reliable positions just to wait and expect another Russian wave of attack. But it was my first opinion of the situation, but later during the day we got more updates and details about the situation in the area, and we got this video. The Russian official sources published a video of another Russian attack on Ukrainian positions. We see on the map on the screen a lot of armored vehicles, personnel carriers, tanks that were heading from the south, from Vysyola to the north. At some point of the video we can see the rich network of Ukrainian fortifications. Then we can see Russian armored vehicles and personnel carriers arrived in the area. Then we can see the landing part of the operation, and then the Russians start clearing the area. They start assaulting, storming, and then clearing the territory. So if we return back on map, we're gonna see that the Russians were moving something like this. They started the Russians started their attack somewhere in the vicinity of Vysyola or somewhere for him, bypassed the fields, entered the territory. On this point, the Russians landed the infantry, the armored vehicles turned and started moving back to Vysyola and, let's say, Bilogorovka. So that was the Russian attack. They reached the area, they landed the infantry started clearing the trenches and fortifications and started the process of digging in deeper. And this is one of the most important progress of the armed forces of Russian Federation, and the thing is that the Russians managed to establish control over this forest and over the hill, because Vysyola and the area around Vysyola is located in the lowland, and these positions are located on the hill. So the Russians managed to, let's say, synchronize the positions of armed forces of Ukraine on the direction and the Russian forces. So now they're on the same level, let's say at the same level, and now it's going to be much more easier for the Russians to move further. So if we, let's say, start drawing arrows, we can say that the Russians during the previous 24 hours were attacking something like this. That was the first video we discussed. So let's say on the let's say eastern part of the railways to Vyimka, to Vysyola, and this is the second wave of a Russian attack, and we see that the Russians are taking this area into pincers, and they're going to be, of course, probably during the next few days we're going to receive more updates about Russian attack, the main Russian strike along the railways. And the main purpose of the Russians is to establish the first stronghold in the area of the railway station by the name of Vyimka. Obviously these are not the only plans of the armed forces of Russian Federation. Very likely that as soon as the Russians establish control over this part of the hill, they will try to move further to the west and in direction with the purpose to encircle Razdolovka and to attack the Ukrainian armed forces that located in Razdolovka from behind, from the northeastern direction. There are a few more strongholds, let's say, on the Russian way, on the Russian road, but very likely due to the fact that the roads are already on the same level with the Russians, they will easily establish control and then move further. So based on all these things, we can make a conclusion that the Ukrainians probably will be forced to fall back, to start the process of falling back from Razdolovka within the next 2 or maybe 3 weeks. Which is not so fast as we understand, but anyway, the front line started movement, and very likely soon very interesting things are going to start happening here. Bilogorovka, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received lots of updates, just few videos, few geolocations of more attempts from the Russian side to clear the area again from Ukrainian soldiers, FPV drone operators, just multiple launch rocket system strikes, FPV drone strikes, artillery strikes, just with the purpose to destroy another stronghold, another shelter of armed forces of Ukraine. And once again, I'll repeat to you that according to some unconfirmed sources, the Ukrainian 81st Brigade, that's the the base, the core of defense on this direction was defeated during the clashes that took place during the previous few days. So Siversk direction obviously is going to be the primary target for the Russians for the next few months, and the Russians, as I understand, during the next few months are planning to collapse Siversk, to capture Siversk, and to start assault operation in direction of Chasiv Yar. From Chasiv Yar we continue receiving more updates. We got very interesting details about the Eastern Bloc New, the Tide Novy, let's call it like this. We have the Russians were bombing the let's say the first edge positions on the eastern part. Those positions that the Russians very likely would try to establish control over at the first phase, and of course then they were going to move further to the west. But for now they need to clear the area to destroy, let's say, machine gun positions, anti-tank positions, ammo depots, warehouses that located on the line of combat contact, and then they will be able to move further. Furthermore, we got the fresh satellite pictures of the area. As you can see, let's say the northern top picture, we see the trenches, a rich network of trenches. Every single square meter in the area was turned into the stronghold and another fortification. But this is not something new for the Russians. They used to see the same story around Bakhmut, around Avdiivka. So the Russians know how to crack these nuts, and obviously the Russians are planning to start doing something like this in the very near future. From the most important, just to remind you that during the previous 20 days, weeks, the Russians, according to geolocated unconfirmed updates, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the trenches and fortifications in front of the Chasiv Yar. Furthermore, currently we can make a conclusion that the area and the forest in this direction is already located in the gray zone, and very likely there are fierce clashes. And as soon as the Russians are able to bypass this forest, they will be able to enter the first buildings and first, let's say, constructions of Chasiv Yar. Furthermore, we have more updates and more strikes against the Ukraine positions further to the west of northwest of Ivanovska. Another multiple launch rocket system strike. Very likely after such artillery preparation, the Russians could make few attempts to attack. And very likely the Russians are already inside of this forest trying to clearing the territory for further offensive operation. But anyway, regarding the Russian progress, regarding the lots of talks about the eastern block of Chasiv Yar, a lot of experts are talking about the main part of Chasiv Yar that is located, let's say, on the Ukrainian side of the Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal. And there are a few important things that we need to understand. The special military operation is already entering the phase of the war of patterns. So we could see something new, let's say, in the beginning of 2022, when everybody was shocked by the massive use of Russian missiles. We, at some point, we entered another pattern of the special military operation when talking about the use of FPV drones, significant number of them. Then we entered another, let's say, pattern that was created basically by the Ukrainians, the combination of artillery and FPV drones. When you attack, Ukrainians start bombing and attacking the Russian offensive with artillery, and then they send FPV drones to clear the area. So we are entering the pattern phase of the special military operation, when parties, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, are going to use the same tactics, but they will try to use them and to make them as much as possible professional, as much as possible better implemented during the operation, and something like this. So when talking about Chasiv Yar, and when talking about the pattern of storming the big strongholds, big towns like Chasiv Yar, like Bakhmut, like Avdiivka, the Russians are going to use the same pattern. And the same pattern is telling us that first of all, the Russians need to clear and to, let's say, to penetrate the Ukrainian flanks in Chasiv Yar. So very likely, if the Russians are planning to establish control over these strongholds, first they need to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt from the south, and to, let's say, to get as close as possible to Chasiv Yar from this direction. From the other side, the Russians need to attack and to clear the Ukrainian positions on the northern flank of Chasiv Yar. For these purposes, they need, despite the bad, let's say, problems and not good results in the past, they need to bypass Bogdanovka, Kalinovka, and to move along Lisova streets toward this area. And the main purpose of these two attacks, of course, as as the same as in Avdiivka direction, as the same as used to be in Bakhmut during the battle for Bakhmut, is to establish complete fire control over the last and the last supply roads that goes to Chasiv Yar, and to create operational encirclement. So the same story as in Bakhmut, the same story as in Avdiivka. We should see in Chasiv Yar as well. And when talking about this, we understand that there are still a lot of things to do. Very unlikely the Russians are going to storm Chasiv Yar in front, because this is going to be a very expensive operation when talking about from let's say personnel perspective. So for this, so that's why we're still gonna see the operation, let's say in the forest to the west of Ivanovska, and Bogdanovka, Kalinovka operation are also going to take place in a very, very near future. Despite the situation in Chasiv Yar, we received a lot of updates from Klishchevka as well. The thing is that Ukrainians understand the Russian plans about the encirclement, about the attacks on the flanks, and the only thing the Ukrainians can do is to reinforce the flanks by sending additional reinforcements and additional manpower. And now we know that Ukrainians have a lack of manpower, they have problems with this, so that's why the only smart and the only reasonable way how to, let's say, reinforce positions in Chasiv Yar is to start the redeployment of forces from Klishchevka, completely useless and unnecessary foothold for the Ukrainian armed forces. So this is the only, let's say, area of operational reserves that Ukrainians can use to reinforce Chasiv Yar. This is the closest area. This area is useless completely for the Ukrainians, so that's why during the previous 24 hours we also see a certain activity of the armed forces of Russian Federation in the direction, because the Russians see that Ukrainians are withdrawing their positions, they're abandoning. Every single day there are less and less forces of the armed forces of Ukraine, so it's the best time for the Russians to clear Klishchevka completely and to restore positions along the Siversk Donetsk-Donbass canal. So very likely during the next let's say 72 or maybe week, we're gonna see 72 hours or a week, we're gonna see some clashes, active clashes on the ground from the Russian side on this direction. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area. As you can see, we also got lots of very interesting details and updates, and the most important that the Russians still haven't managed to establish control over Berdichi. The Ukrainians are sending more and more reinforcements and reserves on the direction, trying to stabilize the area, trying not to allow the Russians to get as close as possible to Novopokrovska and Novoselovka Persha, so on to the second defense belt. And I'll remind you that after the fall of Berdichi, Semyonovka, Orlovka, the next defense belt goes through the towns like Очеретино, Novobakhmutovka, Novopokrovska, Novoselovka Persha, Mizhova, Skuchna, and then this defense belt goes slightly to Karlovka water reservoir. So this is the next defense belt. There are lots of space, operational space for the Russians, but from the other side, this operational space should be bypassed by the Russians, and it requires time, obviously. So Berdych is still under Ukraine control regarding the, let's say, artillery bombings, regarding the strikes, and so on. Semyonovka is under very heavy fire, but still the Russians haven't managed to establish complete control, and the main reason is that Ukrainians still can't use the main supply road that goes from Novoselovka Persha, and using the fields, using this situation, they can send more and more forces, and they use this area for, let's say they can stabilize and they still control. Furthermore, the Russians haven't established complete control over Semyonovka and Berdych. Also, one of the reasons is that currently the main Russian forces are located in the area of Tonenka, in the fields between Tonenka, Severnaya, Vodyana, and Pervomayska. So this is the main concentration of the forces that the Russians are using to move further to the west in direction of Yasnobrodovka. And today some reliable Russian sources have already reported that the Russians established control over the final tree line between Umanska and Yasnobrodovka. Some sources reported that the Russians have already entered and established control over the first building of Umanska on the southern part of Durna River. Currently, we can't confirm this information. Maybe those were just speculations, but very likely by the time you're going to see the video, we're going to receive more details about this. Anyway, regarding the, let's say, absence or presence of updates. According to sources, the Russians cut the main supply road between Umansk, Yasnobrodovka and Nitailova, and basically this area was already cut off and split by the Russians into two parts, and now the Russians will try to handle with every single separate part separately. So the battle for Yasnobrodovka, Nitailova, Pervomaiska, Umanska is also about to be finished by the Russians, and then just then the next phase of offensive operation in Avdiivka direction is going to start, and then it's going to be very interesting where exactly the Russians are planning to move. Very likely the Russians are going to attack Karlovka and Krasnogorovka, because it's just this area, Karlovka, Krasnogorovka, is probably the last area the Ukrainians can use to bomb and attack Donetsk. Today the sources reported that Ukrainians bombed Donetsk once again, and the Ukrainians were bombing Donetsk from the area of Karlovka. After the beginning of the bombardments, the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian artillery position. The Ukrainians were using the, let's say, Palladian, as I understand, the Western weapon, the Western artillery system, to bomb civilians in Donetsk. The Russians discovered this artillery system and destroyed as a result of counter-artillery fire. And now we're moving to Krasnogorovka. After very heavy clashes in March, the Russians stopped any attempts to attack the area. They are continuing clearing operation. They're bombing and attacking the Ukrainian anti-tank positions that located in the southeastern part of the village, but without any active clashes and active operation on the ground. I can't tell for sure when exactly the Russians are going to renew offensive, but very likely after the end of Pervomaiska and Nitailova, and after the Russians are able to connect these footholds into something single, something like common. After, let's say, probably this progress, the Russians will launch and will start the storming and clearing of Krasnogorovka, or attempts to encircle this stronghold as well. But obviously, sooner or later, this town is going to be a target of the armed force of Russian Federation. Georgievka, Marinka. According to information we have, during the previous months there were very heavy clashes on the direction, but now the Russians have stopped. We can see probably the second or third or even a week of operational pause on the direction, just counter-artillery duels, just FPV drone strikes, Lancet strikes, no active clashes, no active offensive on the ground. On this video we can see how the Russians managed to discover another Ukrainian FPV drone operator base, and as a result of a strike, that base was destroyed. Novomikhailivka, another trap, another cheese in the trap for the Ukrainians. The thing is that, for example, I expected that the Russians would already establish control over the village by the 4th of April, but we still see some Ukrainian resistance on the direction, some Ukrainian presence in the area, and I have questions why the Russians still haven't captured the territory. And the thing is that Novomikhailivka, if you take a look at the map, if we let's say summarize updates we received during the previous days, we can make a conclusion that something like this currently is taking place in the area. The Russians have already established operational encirclement. It's the same Avdiivka, it's the same Bakhmut, when the Russians bypassed the flanks and established complete control over the main supply roads from the north and from the south. And the thing is that Ukrainians, I don't know why, but the Ukrainians still continue sending their additional reinforcements inside of the Novomikhailivka, and of course everything that enters Novomikhailivka stays in Novomikhailivka. For example, on this video we can see another light vehicle, probably evacuation machine or support machine, that entered Novomikhailivka. Everything was under fire control, and when this light vehicle stopped, the Russians destroyed this light vehicle within a few seconds. So probably, as I understand, the Russians know and Ukrainians know for sure that Novomikhailivka has already ended. And the only thing that the Russians try to get as much as possible benefits from the situation, and the Russians will try to keep this configuration until the Ukrainians continue sending forces. And if Ukrainians will continue sending forces, let's say a month, and losing soldiers and armored vehicles and every day, the Russians will keep the situation then a month. And as soon as Ukrainians understand that it's, let's say, not very good to send forces and, let's say, vehicles further to Novomikhailivka, and they decide to stop in Konstantinovka, then the Russians will capture Novomikhailivka completely, and they will move further to Konstantinovka with the purpose to create the same story First, the Russians will try to bypass Konstantinovka from the southern flank because it's probably more easy for the Russians. And during the previous days they show us some results and a good experience in that. After, the Russians will try to develop their positions and further offensive operation from Pobeda, trying to establish the same encirclement of Konstantinovka from the north, and from the bottom they will establish fire control over the main supply roads, and everything will be started from the beginning. So half encirclement, operational encirclement, and then pummeling, destroying, attacking, and bombing until the Ukrainians fall back further to the west. And then the story will be repeated once again from the beginning. Very interesting details are coming from Ugledar direction. If you remember, during the previous days we talked a lot about the pummeling and destroying and ruining of Ugledar, and today we got significant number of geolocations from the area to the east of Ugledar. The Russians were using FABs to bomb and attack the Ukrainian positions, which also confirms that very likely the Russians are about to start something interesting on the Ugledar direction. But once again, the pattern is the same. Semi-encircle the town, establish operational encirclement, destroy the upcoming reinforcements, and then to capture the town. So the same story here, but it just depends on the level and experience of the defense forces on this area. We know that 72nd Mechanized Brigade is pretty experienced from the Ukrainian side, so of course it's not going to be a very interesting, very easy trip for the Russians, but very likely few days in a row, the next few days, we're going to see some activity from the Russian side. But the purpose to establish control from the Russian side over these three lines, let's say something like this, to establish control over something like this. This will allow the Russians to get as close as possible to the main supply road T0524. The Russians first will cut the area, and then maybe they will try to semi-encircle Ugledar and try to repeat the same story as Novomikhailovka, Konstantinovka. Великая Новоселовka, Урожайная. During the previous days, the Russians discovered significant number of Ukrainian positions, and during the previous 48-24 hours, the Russians were bombing and attacking, working out every discovered Ukrainian position and direction. Nothing special. Malinovka, another day, another Lmur missile arrived in the area. Hundreds of Lmur missiles the Russians spanned exactly on this direction. This is something like a polygon test area for the Russians. I don't know why there, but only in Malinovka, the Russians are using this type of weapon. For example, since the beginning of operation, there were few Lmur missiles used in Novomikhailovka, some of them in Krynki, but the massive used just here. This very, powerful weapon, but for some reason the Russians are using it just here. Orechov, the Russians discovered the command center of FPV drone, group of on this direction, and as a result of fact that building was destroyed, reduced to ruins, with probably FPV drone operators inside. Nothing special, nothing interesting on the ground. When talking about, global updates, very interesting details are coming, and the most important is that NATO openly confirms that NATO countries will have to send soldiers to Ukraine, otherwise they will accept a catastrophic defeat. US State Department, today official statement. And you know that this is probably true, because now Zelensky is holding and trying to hold the situation just because he expects that sooner or later he will receive some military aid. But according to information we have, US House's Ukraine war aid vote is likely weeks or more away. I'm not sure whether Zelensky have this time, and very likely that United States of America may try to hold the situation as long as possible until May, and then Zelensky is no longer going to be like a legal president, and then they will say that we can't sign anything and provide you anything because we need somebody who has legal signature and who can sign these loans or military aid, and obviously Zelensky is not going to be a man who can do this. Now, furthermore, the Western sources reported that Russian military almost completely reconstituted. Russia has almost completely restored its armed forces after initially suffering losses. Over the past couple of months, we have come to the conclusion that Russia has almost completely recovered military. And this is very important, because if Russia recovered military, then they have strength and forces to start another offensive operation, another summer final offensive operation or something like this. When talking about Moscow, of course, the most important thing, Russia is not putting its economy into wartime mode, Putin said. So according to Putin, there is no war mode. Yes, there are like some aspects, some, let's say, signs of war mode economy, but it's not 100% war mode economy. And so we'll see. I can't even imagine what does it mean to have Russia on war mode economy. It's something very dangerous and very obviously dangerous, yes. Russia and France have a call. Minister of Defense can't tell for sure what they were talking about. The sources are saying that France have some, let's say, important information about the terrorist attack that took place in Moscow in Crocus City Hall. Maybe France want to have some trade with Russia. They will provide this information, and for exchange they will require some guarantees for the 1,000 or 2,000 troopers of France forces that will be redeployed on the territory of Ukraine. I'm not sure whether Putin is going to go on the deal, but who knows, because it's very important to understand who was the side who ordered that, who was the customer of that terrorist attack. And probably the most important, military intelligence. Russia has about 200 Su-34, Su-35 fighter jets. Significant number, 200 aircrafts that can attack, that can carry, let's say, these guided bombs, these very powerful ones. And according to information we have, Russia used just maybe 50 on the territory of the special military operation, and 150 are waiting for their time to, let's say, to get involved into combat action. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.